do you think is the most urgent crisis to address, climate change or biodiversity loss? Which should claim a priority in our response and which could wait for later? Or is this a valid question? You probably have noticed that these two crises of modernity are mostly dealt with as separate issues. Most often, the impacts of climate change on disappearance of species are studied well and discussed as one-way impact. Here, I propose you to think of the two-way interaction between two processes and the way they not only interact but also reinforce each other. We understand by now multiple ways in which climate change impacts biodiversity, from, for example, heat stress on individuals, or increased mortality in populations, all the way to dramatic changes in whole communities and shifts in biomes. This is especially prominent in polar and alpine environments, as called adapted communities retreat. Some of these are direct through rising temperatures, but some are indirect, such as changes in the acidity and oxygen depletion in seawater or rising sea levels. However, extinction of species is not only a sad fact. It is also have grave consequences to the climate regulation itself. I'd like to illustrate three such. The first is about a somewhat unexpected relationship between loss of species and carbon storage. The study comes from Brazil's Atlantic forest, a highly endangered biodiversity hotspot with about 2,000 tree species and over 800 animal species. The researchers analyzed what animals eat and disperse seeds of what trees, and simulated consequences of a loss of large animals. They are the ones that commonly disappear due to hunting and forest fragmentation. The researchers discovered that such loss would mean an unforeseen consequence of a reduction in the carbon stock in the forest. The cause is simple. Only large animals disperse big seeds. True for many forest biomes. And big seeds are produced by large hardwood trees that in turn have a large carbon storage potential. In this case, conservation of large charismatic mammals and birds could also contribute to the capture of carbon and therefore slow down the climate breakdown. Similar results have been shown also for other forests, for example in India. Now, the second study illustrates two large-scale, real-world and long-term consequences. Researchers in Switzerland combined species inventories across the country with remotely sensed indices of primary productivity, that is biomass growth, for 15 years. They discovered that biodiversity, species richness of plants and other organisms, not only related to a higher primary productivity across the landscapes, but it also supported the temporal stability of primary productivity across the years. The more species, the less variable is biomass production from year to year. Furthermore, they discovered that in more species-rich sites, plant communities were better responding to the climate change during those 15 study years by lengthening the growth season. Thus, communities with more species were better able to adapt to a long-term trend and continued their functioning despite it. My third example is based on an idea of tipping points, places of no return in a process. In this case, there is accumulating evidence that climate change combined with deforestation and fires pushes the Amazon rainforest towards a tipping point, after which the existing forest community may lose the ability to restore itself and starts turning into a sparsely forested savanna. This change will be accompanied by a massive die-off of species and release of carbon, which further accelerates the climate change. The above gives a glimpse at a duality of the processes. On one hand, climate change is among the main drivers of biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. And on the other, loss of species and destruction of ecosystem functioning undermines nature's ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and store carbon. The capacity of ecosystems to adapt to the climate change and persist despite it is also weakened and may lead to further species losses. Thus, climate change accelerates and ecosystem become more vulnerable to it. And the two processes reinforce each other, creating a vicious circle. This underlines why the two crises must be tackled together. To do so, we first must acknowledge this fact. This is finally done in two new reports from influential intergovernmental panels operating under the United Nations. One on climate change, IPCC, and the other on biodiversity and ecosystem services, EPBES. The report's authors conclude that solutions that take both issues into account have the best chance of success. Several reviews analyzed approaches that address both crises. To name the key ones, first, expanding and connecting the network of protected areas for ecosystems that can both store large amounts of carbon and support considerable biodiversity. Such are, for example, coastal ecosystems such as mangroves, seagrass, salt marshes. There is good evidence for a substantial overlap over 90% in protection of areas that reverse biodiversity loss and those enhancing carbon storage and drawdown. The second would be restoring forests and woodlands, but this should be done with native species and their diversity, rather than planting monocultures of non-native species. The latter do not contribute to biodiversity and are prone to wildfires. The next would be reducing runoff into rivers, lakes, and coastal waters from excess nutrients. They cause algae blooms and oxygen-depleted waters. Such eutrophication combined with warming increases greenhouse gas emissions and harms aquatic life. However, and probably most importantly, it is time to realize that all the crises of modernity, climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, as well as the rising risk of geopolitical instability, are in fact strongly interlinked. They ultimately stem from the fact that we are drastically exceeding Earth's resources. We must reduce our overconsumption of the planetary resources. This is where all of us can have a role by personal choices and by pushing for the right policies and actions at high social levels.